You're listening to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, the go-to podcast for high performers. I'm Andrew Moses. Each week, you'll hear my thought-provoking conversations with Olympians, pro athletes, CEOs, elite coaches, best-selling authors, and other high performers to uncover their secrets to success. Get ready to be inspired each week when we talk about leadership, teamwork, work ethic, and more. Are you ready? Let's go. This week, my guest is former United States Air Force fighter pilot, Michelle "MACE" Curran. Michelle spent 13 years as a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force. Flying under her pilot callsign MACE, she flew F-16s in combat missions in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And from 2019 to 2021, she flew as the only female pilot for the Air Force Thunderbirds. And Michelle became only the second woman to fly the lead solo in the Thunderbirds demonstration since the team's creation in 1953. As part of the Thunderbirds, Michelle has performed for millions across the United States and around the globe. Now, Michelle is the author of best-selling children's book Upside Down Dreams, and she is on a mission to inspire and empower others to shift their mindset, overcome fears, and see their full potential. In our conversation, you'll hear actionable lessons on how to turn curiosity into progress, get more comfortable making mistakes, maximize your learning from past experiences, and so much more. If you are ready to power your personal and professional journey to all-time new heights, then this conversation is for you. So, let's pull the tarp and get straight to Michelle "MACE" Curran. Michelle, first off, thank you for your service and welcome to Everybody Pulls the Tarp.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for our conversation.
Michelle, where I want to begin, you grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. I'm curious, do you remember the first time flying on an airplane or experiencing aviation? Like, was that a memory for you that stands out?
Yeah, definitely. Small town, not an aviation family, not a military family. So I just didn't have a lot of exposure to it. My first time on an airplane was a commercial flight from Medford, Wisconsin. Well, there's no airport there that you fly out of, but near there, to, oddly enough, Las Vegas, Nevada, which is where I live now. So it's kind of come full circle, but my aunt and uncle were actually getting married here in Vegas at one of the little tourist chapels that are here. And I got to come with, and I was in third grade. And I distinctly remember, and my mom actually has a really crappy quality, blurry photo of me like staring straight ahead with the airplane window next to me, just this like sheer look of excitement during takeoff. Yeah, so it's cool that it was to Vegas and now I live here.
So did that moment evoke any inspiration in you that you remember where you said, I'm going to be a pilot one day?
Not quite to that specificity. I remember being so excited about it. I was just a really adventurous kid. And so anything that kind of fulfilled that exciting drive from, roller coasters to that first flight got me really pumped up. But at that age, I didn't really connect the dots that I could be a pilot someday. And I went through many iterations, as kids do, of what I wanted to do. And I think there were, at least 3 or 4 things in between that age and finally deciding that I wanted to be a pilot.
Michelle, you talked about kind of this adventurous childhood, love of roller coasters. What else? What were some of the other kind of adventurous things that you would do as a kid? And would you do them with other people? Would you do them yourselves, kind of independently? Talk about that for a minute.
So I grew up in a small town, about 4,000 people, and we actually lived about 7 miles outside of town in the country. And my grandparents had a dairy farm that was like our next door neighbor, essentially. And so I have an older brother and sister, but they're 7 years and 9 years older than me. So a lot of the time I was essentially an only child as far as playing by myself. And I would get into all kinds of trouble. I was a very well-behaved kid, but my mom has all kinds of stories about me climbing trees higher than the house and like building rafts on the river in the woods behind our house. And we had a pond and I would swim in there. And here's a good example. My grandparents had a hay mow in the top of their barn and had these like huge wood beams. And my neighbor and I, she lived like, half a mile away. We took the dog run cable from her German Shepherd, like the cable that people would string between 2 trees and then the leash. And we made a zip line through the top of the barn. Probably not weight spec'd for 6th graders or whatever we were at the age. But Yeah, we were just I was adventurous and kind of fearless. And I think had this drive to explore and just kind of push my limits. And I think that's what eventually drove me to aviation.
Where do you think that curiosity came from to explore all these different things? Like, have you tried to unpack that at all? Like, where do you think that really resides inside you?
I think my parents did a really good job, despite having pretty limited resources, of giving me a lot of exposure to things. We did a lot of road trips, which I would always ask why we couldn't fly places, but it was because it was more expensive. And so we road tripped all across the country and national parks. I remember when I was young, my dad started telling me stories from hunting magazines, like outdoor adventure stories about grizzly bears and mountain lions. And I actually started hunting with him when I was just old enough to walk along. I was probably like 8 or 9. And so that gave me some independence. It got me outdoors. And then I also remember him, I think he actually read it to me, the book Into Thin Air, about the Mount Everest kind of disaster in the 90s. And it's such a great book. And I've gotten into mountaineering myself as an adult, but I remember him reading that to me and just being like completely fascinated by it. And we would watch documentaries on that kind of stuff together. And so I think it came really from my parents. And as I became an adult, I kind of found my own version of it. But just as long as I can remember, there's been something in my life that kind of pushed me to explore those types of things.
Michelle, fast forward. Obviously, you enter the military. What first drew you to the military in that experience? You mentioned that you didn't come from a military or flying family, I think you said earlier, but what drew you to the military?
Yeah, so I was in high school, probably a junior, and my parents were like, "Hey, you have a really good GPA. We do not have a college fund for you. Let's talk about scholarship options." And it was, again, my dad who had gone to the University of Wisconsin and seen ROTC cadets running around in their uniforms. He wasn't in ROTC himself, but he knew that a lot of them were there on scholarships. He knew that they all had jobs waiting for them, when they graduated. And he knew me pretty well. So he knew my sense of adventure and that I didn't want to stay in my hometown. And he encouraged me to apply for an Air Force ROTC scholarship, or just generally an ROTC scholarship. I kind of picked Air Force. And initially I was resistant to it because I just didn't really know what it entailed. And I had this idea in my head as like a 16-year-old at the time that I wanted to be just a normal college student and do all the normal college student things, whatever that means. And turns out ROTC, you can do that. I got to be a normal kid, live in the dorms, do all the things. And then I just put my uniform on, 1 or 2 days a week. And I got a full scholarship thanks to them. And so I wish I could be like, I had this purpose. I wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to serve my country. But at 16 years old, it was kind of a means to an end to pay for school, for the education benefits. And it evolved into more later.
You used the phrase earlier, you were a well-behaved kid, but you also had it kind of paired with this adventurous curiosity, get into a little bit of mischief. But like you said, you were a well-behaved kid. When you get into the ROTC program, is that really the first time that you have to start kind of reconciling these two, this discipline and behavior and structure with this adventurous curiosity that you also have? Like, I'm curious, like, when did that blend start kind of rearing its head for you?
I think it's actually the perfect environment for that because I was always a rule follower. I was like, I just did what my parents told me and did what my teachers told me. And my sister was much more of a rebel than I was. And she would always give me a hard time that I was just like goody two shoes or whatever. But then my parents also created a space where I could just be like out adventuring around our house because they knew I wasn't getting into trouble. That's much better than me being like out with a bunch of people where they don't know where I am. And so ROTC, I guess, appealed to my rule following side and actually did really well. I kind of excelled in that environment. And I also was getting to experience all these new things. So the adventure side was fulfilled as well. And it was halfway through that program where I had that moment where I'm like, okay, I want to be a pilot. Because I was actually a criminal justice major in college. I planned on doing 4 years in the Air Force to pay back the education time, getting out, and I wanted to apply to the FBI Academy. And so I took a hard right. I think it was either end of sophomore year, beginning of junior year. And I actually got to visit a base with my ROTC detachment. and see two fighter jets take off in full afterburner for the first time. It was two F-15s, the giant orange flame coming out the back. And I had seen jets before, but never like from the edge of the runway where it's just so impressive to be that close. And I was just like, holy crap, how do I go do that? Like, forget this FBI thing. I want to go fly jets. So yeah, the Air Force journey all the way to being a fighter pilot kind of just happened over time. I did not go in with a vision right out the gate.
Michelle, I can just kind of envision you standing there watching that, as it unfolds and say, this is what I'm going to do. But then doing it is a whole other thing. So take me through some of the next steps that happen subsequently there. How do you go from I'm going to do that to actually doing it?
So I was already, in a program that sets you up to get into the Air Force, and to be a pilot is one of the ways to do it. And so I was going to commission as a lieutenant, as an officer in the Air Force at the end of ROTC, no matter what career field I went into. It's about junior year where the leadership there starts to be like, okay, who's interested in competing for a pilot slot? And your major doesn't actually matter in that. So you could be a music major or you could be an electrical engineer, and you're still competing against each other for this limited number of spots. And it was based on GPA, physical fitness, and then the vague one, the catch-all, cadet leadership. And I had, put a lot of effort into physical fitness throughout the ROTC program and started to do a lot better in that area. And then kind of those study habits I always had through childhood all the way through high school that allowed me to get a scholarship continued to serve me well in college. So my GPA was good. You can get into the discussion that 3.9 as a criminal justice major versus a 3.9 as a biochemistry major are two very different things. But that's a little bit of gamesmanship with how the Air Force decides things, that they just see the number. They don't see the major as a really huge deciding factor. So it was really just putting my name in the hat, throwing it out there and seeing what happened, and ended up getting one. And it wasn't too competitive to get the initial pilot slot, but it got much more difficult as I moved towards actually pursuing becoming a fighter pilot specifically. Because I graduated, went off to pilot training, went through a bunch of smaller miscellaneous trainings, but the general undergraduate pilot training program is a year long. And that took me from 0 flight hours to soloing in a T6, flying a bunch of time there, eventually going down the fighter bomber track, which is halfway through the program. And you have to be in the top half of the class to even be considered for that. And then my class of 25 had 6 spots. So 6 of us ended up going into the next pool, where we now moved to a jet trainer that even makes us eligible to possibly get a fighter jet at the end of the program. And so it's like these ever tightening wickets as you go, and it gets more and more competitive. And, I was pretty sure I would get a pilot slot because I knew I was doing well. And then as I'm halfway through that program, I knew I was not only in the top of my class or top half, but I kind of was fairly confident I was in about the top 10% of my class. You don't ever get to see that ranking, but you know how everyone's doing. You kind of have this general sense. And so I felt fairly confident that I was going to get to move into that fighter track if I wanted it. And when the real obstacle came, it's actually getting the jet itself at the very end of the program. Because again, the class of 25 and classes before ours were getting anywhere from 1 to 3 fighter aircraft. And it just depended on the needs of the Air Force. And so I knew I didn't have to just make it into that pool of 6. I had to be in the top 1 or 2 in that pool of 6. And so that's when it really got serious. And I went into this whole thing with seeing 2 fighter jets take off is what inspired it. I didn't want to just be a pilot. I wanted to be a fighter pilot, which when people talk to me about joining the Air Force and becoming a pilot, I always encourage them to set that goal, but be okay if it doesn't work out, because you're going to end up being in the Air Force still. You get, a C-17 or some other cargo aircraft. You can't be like, oh, just kidding, because they've already spent millions of dollars to train you. So you have a 10-year contract. So you're kind of in it at that point. But I got one. I got the F-16, one of 2 fighter jets for the class. And it was off to the races from there. So Michelle, take me through learning to fly an F-16, because like you said, it's kind of these narrowing wickets as you kind of move through the program and the different opportunities.
Now you're going to learn to fly an F-16. I'm just envisioning, I've never flown a plane, I mean, other than sitting in the back with the passengers. I'm just imagining a million sensors and dials and buttons and procedures and things that you have to learn, and lessons on top of lessons on top of lessons. How do you even begin to work through that and learn so much in a relatively short period of time?
It's not easy, but the Air Force has created this system to do exactly that for people. It's normal for people to come into that program with very limited aviation experience, if not zero, like I had, get through pilot training, and each course you move through, it's a building block approach. They get progressively more difficult. The aircraft get progressively faster, and you're learning and your pace you're able to think in the cockpit, it increases slowly as you move into those more advanced aircraft. So there is no way I could have gone from 0 flight hours to just learning to fly the F-16, right? There needed to be a lot of small steps in between there. You know, the first airplane I flew in, the DA-20, flew like 90 knots. And then the F-16, you know, go twice the speed of sound. So they're very different. It's challenging stepping into the F-16. It's so overpowered that it can get away from you very quickly. Like, you have to be very careful with modulating the power. You have to be careful with the high G forces because those can be dangerous. Imagine someone getting on a crotch rocket motorcycle and just going full throttle. Like, what would happen? It's similar. You have to be very careful with what you're doing because the machine can outperform you any day. And so it's just kind of learning your limits, figuring out where they are. You make mistakes all the time, but your instructors are really good at what they do. And hopefully they're able to kind of direct you and help you keep those mistakes within the margins of safety. And you keep just progressing over time. But I mean, I did not only did I not feel, but I was not a good F-16 pilot by the time I graduated the initial 1 year long course. And then I don't really feel like I got my footing in the jet for probably another 3 years or so. Like, it just takes a lot of time and experience to really get your arms around it.
You mentioned the word system there earlier, Michelle. You said the Air Force sets up a great system to help you learn all this, both kind of the strategic and the tactical side of all this in a relatively short period of time. But, you know, a system is only as good as an individual's ability to adapt to it. What were some of the things that you needed to do personally to fit that system and make the system work for you?
I had to spend a lot of time preparing and studying outside of the formal course when I was at home in the evenings, on the weekends. I did a lot of chair flying, which sounds really silly, but it's visualization techniques. I mean, athletes use it. It's just, we call it chair flying in aviation. And when you're in the very beginning learning phases, it is literally taking a poster that shows the cockpit with all of those switches and the stick and the throttle, putting it on a blank wall in your house and sitting there in a desk chair in a quiet room and talking through ground operations, the radio calls, like flipping fake switches, imagining where they would be in the cockpit, imagining where you're going to look when and what you're going to see. And I would do that pretty much for every flight, all through pilot training and into F-16 training, early on, all the way from strapping into the aircraft and starting it all the way through landing. And as I got more experienced, eventually I could skip the ground operations phase. I could skip to just like the new material, the tactical part. But I spent so many hours sitting in a room in a desk chair, pretending to fly. And it sounds so silly, but I legitimately think that I would not have gotten through that program if I hadn't done that, because I came in, like I said, with no flight time. So I had to learn so much in such a short amount of time. And the Air Force system is really good, but I don't think there's enough resources there to take someone from 0 flight experience to being a fighter pilot in the amount of time available, unless you're willing to do that all on your own as well. It's the combination of the two.
I feel like listening to you describe that, it almost feels like when a person goes through medical school, then they go to their residency. Like, it's two distinctly different things. And if, like, while you're a medical resident, you're not putting in extra time to kind of prepare and understand what's going on, it's going to be really hard to keep up, even though you've had all this formal training through this system that whatever medical school the person went to has developed.
So there's a ton of parallels there. And I actually use that example quite often because I got to my first assignment, my actual first combat squadron, after 3+ years of formal training through all these pipelines. And you feel like you've done so much education and so much training that you should kind of know what you're doing. And then you get to the actual job and you're like, oh crap, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Like it's going to take years of on the job experience to actually get good at this. And I've talked to a lot of doctors and they're like, it's the exact same for us. It can be very disheartening and overwhelming when you kind of have that moment where you're just like, whoa, all of that I've done now, like that was just the beginning. Like this isn't a finish line. This is the starting gun.
How did you reconcile, obviously you talked about this margin of margin of safety range that you're operating within. I've talked to so many Olympic athletes, professional athletes, high performers from all walks of life on this show every single week. And so many high performers wrestle with this issue of perfectionism. But with what you were doing, Michelle, I mean, the margin for error is pretty narrow from a safety and wellness perspective. How did you reconcile that? Because it's got to be really challenging to feel like you're in a lane where you have to be so perfect and so precise, but also give yourself the space to develop and maneuver. Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give the examples on the Thunderbirds because I think that's the most visible example of such a fine line of execution. And there's just not a lot of margin for error. Things can go wrong very quickly in that environment. And from the time you become a pilot, especially as you come into the fighter pilot community, there's a ton of emphasis put on the debrief process. And your mistakes in the cockpit are looked at during that debrief every single flight. And it just becomes so normalized that that's what we do that it kind of takes away the shame around mistakes. And you realize that every single pilot, no matter if they're in their first year in the job or they're in their 20th year in the job, never has a perfect flight. It does not exist. You're going to have small deviations every single time. It's a few knots of airspeed, a few feet off of altitude. Perfection does not exist. And so once you realize that, like with the Thunderbirds, we would get so much better from the first air show of the season to the last air show of the season. Like it's very noticeable if you were to see one of the first and one of the last. The team gets progressively better because they're melded together more. They've worked together with that specific group of pilots for a lot more reps, and you just get better over time. And so I think the mentality we went into it was there will never be a perfect show. There'll never be a perfect demo, but our goal is to progressively get better each time. That last show of the year might look really, really good. We might be really happy with it. The audience might think it was perfect, but we know it wasn't perfect. And once you kind of just think about it that way and you accept that, like, okay, we're going to keep getting better all the time, but we're never going to reach perfection, then it takes away that pressure. And small mistakes, like small deviations, are treated differently than something that's a dangerous, poor judgment mistake, something that's a near miss that could have been catastrophic. Those mistakes are taken very, very seriously. They're dug into. It's not like a shame you type thing. It's more of like, okay, we dodged the bullet here. We realize how bad that could have been. What can we do to keep this from ever happening again? And so not all mistakes are created equal. And I think that's where people get confused is like, I want an environment where my team can fail all the time. Like they feel safe where they can be innovative and they can evolve and they can push their limits, and failure comes with that. That does not mean I want someone in a jet, making willy-nilly mistakes and pushing the limits and letting their ego get out there and trying to like show off. That's what gets people killed. And so there's a differentiation there.
There certainly is a difference in the types of mistakes. I think that's an important point you made there, Michelle. I also every time I talk to somebody with a military background or military experience, I'm always amazed at the power of the debrief and why more businesses or other organizations don't utilize the debrief process to get better and improve and make marginal improvements. Sports teams, I talk to a lot of coaches and a lot of athletes, like I talked about a moment ago, are really good at this process too. They review game film from the wins and the losses, the successes and the failures, and they're always learning. But in the business community, it's not something that you hear, as pervasive, and I think it should be.
No, absolutely. I hear that all the time when I'm out speaking to corporate audiences. And there's a lot of parallels with the high performance team, in the military, whether that's the Thunderbirds or it's a Navy SEAL unit or whatever it is, and professional athletes. And all of those environments in these really high performance atmospheres from the outside, it looks like everyone has big egos, right? You think of professional athletes, there's egos there. You think of fighter pilots, there's egos there. But I know for us, and I think it's the same in a lot of those communities, there's a time and a place where those egos are shed. And if you can't do that, if you can't take feedback and you can't admit mistakes and you can't look at how you can improve for next time, you aren't going to last very long in that environment. You're going to get weeded out pretty quickly. And so while the best performers might look arrogant even to the outside perspective, that is all shed behind closed doors. And if it's not, you're not going to do well.
Was that something, Michelle, that you had to work on? That were you naturally kind of agreeable to sharing kind of failures and challenges and adversity, or was that something that you needed to develop a muscle for?
It definitely took time, and not really because I came in with this big ego. It was almost the opposite. I came in, we talked about being adventurous, but I was also a very shy and introverted kid in public. I kind of had social anxiety. I didn't love being in front of people or put on the spot or anything like that. And the Air Force forced me out of my comfort zone in that regard again and again and again. And eventually you just get better at it. But when I came into the fighter community, I felt like I had to be that type A, very outspoken, assertive person. And that's just really not my personality. And so I kind of pretended to be for a long time. But I always call it playing dress up. I was Michelle. And then at work, I was Mace and I was fighter pilot dress up. And that works for a while, but it's not sustainable. It burns you out and it keeps you from making true connections with friends, of finding mentors. There's a whole bunch of issues with doing that. It can work for a short amount of time. But one of the things that came with that is I felt like I had to prove myself in that environment. So I didn't feel like I could show weakness or vulnerabilities. And so I wouldn't admit mistakes unless I was like put on the spot, like it was very obvious. Once it was out there, I was very agreeable to instruction. I was a rule follower, like I said. So I would be like, yes, sir, I'll work on that. I moved on. But on the inside, I was so afraid of people thinking that I didn't deserve to be there that I resisted putting myself into situations where I might make mistakes or I might fail. And so I kind of just did what I had to do to survive at first. But I definitely missed out on a lot of opportunities because stuff would pop up where they're like, hey, we need someone to lead mission X, Y, and Z. And even though I was qualified, I would be like, please do not pick me. Please do not pick me. Because I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to fail in front of others. And that took me a long time in my career to kind of get the confidence to be okay with that and accept that. So yeah, I struggled with it initially.
Michelle, you talk about this shy personality, that's kind of, you've kind of broken the shell from that shy personality. And now you speak to thousands of people on stages to tell your story, and you're inspiring so many. As we wind down our conversation today, I'm curious, is there a moment that you can recall when you've walked off one of those stages and somebody has said something to you or someone's asked you something and you just said, this is all worth it. Like, this is my calling right now. Like, do you have a moment like that?
Yeah, I've had many. I actually just had one last week and it was one of the most powerful ones I've had. I've been doing this a year and a half or so still fairly new to the speaking industry, but I was at an event just last week and this guy pulled me aside, and he's a big guy. He's a contractor, like very masculine. And I talk about vulnerability. I talk about fear and failure and self-doubt. So my topics are a little bit more touchy-feely than you imagine coming from a fighter pilot. And he was like, hey, I came to this event last year and there was a great speaker that year. And I took away this one key thing I was going to implement in my life around fitness from that person. And I lost 150 pounds over the last year because of that. And I was just like, congratulations, that's incredible. And he's like, I came back to this event this year because I was looking for that thing I could take away and change my life with over the next 365 days. And I was like the third day of speakers at this event. And he's like, your keynote just gave me that. And I almost started crying. I just wanted to hug this big, like 6'4", 300-pound guy. Because I was just like, if he actually follows through with that, which based on his track record, I have no doubt he will, Like, you can drastically change someone's life in one speech. And if there's just a few people in each audience that have a reaction like that, that's why I do this.
Michelle, it's such powerful stuff. I have enjoyed our conversation so much today. First off, like I said, thank you so much for your service and for all the hard work and dedication and sacrifice that you put in to defend the United States of America. And thank you for all that you're doing today to motivate people and to celebrate the power of great leadership, great teamwork, and collaboration and vulnerability, and so many of these important principles that are critical to our success. Michelle, I can't wait to keep following your story. You are, no question, a tarp puller, forever part of the Everybody Pulls the Tarp community. Thank you for spending some time with me this week, all right?
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tarp pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andrew H. Moses. That's Andrew H. Moses. And be sure to sign up for my email newsletter at everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Today is a great day to pull the tarp. I am rooting for you. See you next time.